73 BC. A man stands in an arena in Capua, Italy, surrounded by sand soaked in the blood of men who died entertaining strangers. He is a slave. He owns nothing. He has no rights under Roman law. Not to his body, not to his family, not to his life. The Romans who watch him fight do not see a person. They see property performing its function. They see an investment either earning its return or being destroyed in the process. And yet something is happening inside this man that the Romans watching him cannot see and would not believe if they could. He is planning. He is organizing. He is building something in the only space the Romans cannot reach, his own mind. His name is Spartacus. And within 2 years, this single slave will command an army of 120,000 people that will bring the most powerful military civilization on earth to its knees and make every Roman senator lie awake at night afraid of what comes next. Before we go any further, I want to tell you something that most documentaries and movies about Spartacus never fully acknowledge. We do not know as much about him as we think we do. The sources we have, primarily Plutarch, Appian, and Florus, were all written by Romans decades or centuries after the events, from the perspective of the civilization that hunted him down and killed him. There is no Spartacus memoir. There is no account written by someone who fought beside him or believed in what he was doing. Everything we know about the man himself comes filtered through the eyes of people who needed him to be either a monster or a curiosity, never a legitimate human being with legitimate grievances making legitimate choices. Keeping that in mind changes everything about how you hear this story. The world Spartacus was born into is essential for understanding why what he did was possible and why it was so terrifying to Rome. The Roman slave system in the 1st century BC was one of the largest and most comprehensive systems of human bondage in the ancient world. Estimates suggest that by the time of Spartacus's revolt, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the entire population of Italy was enslaved. Not 1/4 of the lower classes, 1/4 of everyone. In some agricultural regions of southern Italy, the proportion was even higher. Enormous slave-worked estates called latifundia had replaced the small farms of free Italian peasants across vast stretches of the countryside, as Roman conquest brought hundreds of thousands of war captives into Italy as slave labor. The scale of the system is almost impossible to fully absorb. Millions of human beings legally classified as property. The conditions within this system varied enormously. Educated slaves who worked in Roman households as tutors, doctors, secretaries, and administrators could live in conditions that were materially comfortable even if their fundamental legal status was that of property. Agricultural slaves working the latifundia and chain gangs under armed supervision lived in conditions that ancient sources describe with a bleakness that even Roman writers who accepted slavery as natural occasionally found disturbing. Mine slaves, working in the silver and gold mines of Spain and elsewhere, lived in conditions so brutal that death within a few years of beginning mine work was essentially the normal outcome. The system existed across an enormous range of human experience, but its foundation was the same everywhere: a human being reduced to an object whose existence served the purposes of someone else. Gladiatorial slaves occupied a specific and strange position within this system. They were expensive investments. The training required to produce a competent gladiator was extensive, and the schools that housed them represented significant financial commitments by their owners. This meant gladiatorial slaves were generally better fed, better housed, and received better medical care than almost any other category of slave in the Roman world. Their physical condition was their owner's financial asset and was maintained accordingly. But this material relative comfort existed alongside a fundamental condition that made their situation uniquely psychologically crushing. They killed people for entertainment, not in war where killing serves a purpose that can be understood through frameworks of honor and necessity. In an arena where strangers watched and cheered, and the only meaning was the crowd's pleasure and the owner's profit. So who was Spartacus before he was a gladiator, before he was a slave, before he was a legend? This is where the sources are most frustratingly thin and where the historical debate is most active. What ancient sources agree on is that he was Thracian,
Quickly
from the
now,
region that is
unload
now
the grain.
Bulgaria and northern
Make sure the
Greece.
weapons are secured
Thrace was a
immediately.
territory that Rome had been expanding into and fighting with for
cavalry screens the
generations,
flank here.
a region of
If the
fierce
Gauls
warrior
push through,
cultures that
the
had
auxiliaries
produced
must hold this
soldiers of
position
genuine
until the legions
quality
can
who
reform
served in
behind.
armies across the Mediterranean world. Being Thracian in the 1st century BC meant coming from a culture with its own military traditions, its own concept of honor, its own understanding of what a man owed to himself and his people. It did not mean being primitive or barbaric, whatever Roman sources implied. Plutarch tells us something specific about Spartacus's background that most
Move along,
retellings
keep moving.
overlook. He says Spartacus had
Make
served
way,
in the
clear the
Roman
road for the
auxiliary
shipment.
forces before becoming a slave, that he had fought alongside Roman legions at some point before his enslavement. If true, this is extraordinarily important for understanding what came later.
Move along now.
A man who had served in the
barracks,
Roman military understood Roman tactics, Roman formations, Roman command structures, Roman supply systems from the
Strong enough for
inside.
heavy labor
He
or
had
the
seen how the
games.
legions worked
Make a note of
not
his
as an
height and
enemy
weight.
watching from the other side of a battlefield, but as a participant operating within the system. That knowledge, the intimate operational knowledge of how Rome's military machine actually functioned, would prove devastating when deployed against it. How he became a slave is not clearly established in the sources. The most likely explanation, given the historical context, is captured during one of Rome's military operations in Thrace or the surrounding regions. War captives were one of the primary sources of slaves in the Roman world, and Thracians were frequently enslaved through military conflict with Rome during this period. At some point, probably in his 20s or early 30s, Spartacus went from free Thracian warrior to Roman property. He ended up at the gladiatorial school of Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Batiatus in Capua, one of the most important gladiatorial training centers in Italy. Whether this placement was deliberate because of his evident physical capability and fighting background, or simply the result of the slave market's normal operations, is unknown. Ancient sources mention two women in connection with Spartacus at the school in Capua. One is his wife, unnamed in most sources, described as a prophetess from his own Thracian people who shared his captivity. Plutarch describes a specific moment that has become one of the most famous images associated with Spartacus. When he first arrived at the school, a snake was found coiled around his face while he slept, and his wife interpreted this as a sign of great and terrible power in his future. Whether this story is literally true or is the kind of mythologizing that attaches itself to legendary figures in ancient sources is impossible to determine. What is certain is that the presence of his wife at the school meant Spartacus had something most slaves were systematically denied, a human relationship that persisted into captivity. The gladiatorial school at Capua was a world of its own, physically secure, tightly controlled, organized around the production of fighting men for the arena. The gladiators lived in barracks, trained under armed supervision, ate and slept and exercised according to schedules designed to maximize their physical condition and fighting capability. They were not chained constantly. The school was secure enough that this was unnecessary under normal conditions. But they were watched. Their movements were controlled. Their contact with the outside world was limited and monitored. The men in these schools came from across the Roman world: Gauls, Germans, Thracians, Greeks, Romans of low status. Different languages, different cultures, different backgrounds united by their legal status as property and their function as entertainment. Spartacus looked at these men and saw something the school's owners did not. 73 BC. The conspiracy that would change the ancient world began in the barracks of the school at Capua. Ancient sources say that approximately 200 gladiators were involved in the initial plan, a mass escape organized with a level of coordination and secrecy that speaks to both the organizational capability of whoever was leading it and the absolute desperation of men who understood that their lives were being consumed one arena appearance at a time. The plan was discovered before it could be fully executed. Someone talked or someone noticed something that should not have been noticed, and the school's management became aware that something was happening. Most of the conspiracy was suppressed before it began, but approximately 78 men got out. They raided a food storage facility on the way out and armed themselves with kitchen implements, cleavers, knives, cooking tools, before they reached the road. They encountered wagons carrying gladiatorial equipment on the road and seized proper weapons from them: swords, spears, shields. 78 men with stolen weapons running from the most powerful city in the world. The rational analysis of their situation was not encouraging. Rome had legions. Rome had cavalry. Rome had the administrative machinery of an empire designed, among other things, for exactly this kind of situation: tracking down escaped slaves and making examples of them that would discourage anyone considering similar action. Escaped slaves who were caught faced crucifixion, the most public and most agonizing death Rome had available, specifically because it was designed to be visible and to communicate a message to everyone who saw it. 78 men with kitchen knives and stolen swords running toward a mountain. That was where it started. They ran to Mount Vesuvius, the volcano that would destroy Pompeii 150 years later, but that in 73 BC was simply a large mountain with a crater at its summit offering a defensible position that would be difficult for pursuing forces to assault directly. On Vesuvius, they began to do something that transformed them from escaped criminals into something Rome had not dealt with in generations. They began recruiting. Word spread through the slave population of the surrounding countryside with a speed that tells you everything about how desperately the enslaved population of Italy had been waiting for exactly this kind of signal. Agricultural slaves from the latifundiar estates of Campania began making their way to Vesuvius in numbers that quickly exceeded anything the original 78 escapees could have anticipated or planned for. Rome's initial response was the response of a system that had not yet understood what it was dealing with. The praetor Gaius Claudius Glaber was sent with approximately 3,000 men, not a legion, not a serious military force, but the kind of police action force appropriate for dealing with a slave disturbance. He positioned his force at the base of Vesuvius, blocking the main path down the mountain, and settled into wait. His logic was straightforward: no food or water on the mountain. They will either surrender or starve. It was the correct analysis for a normal slave revolt. Spartacus was not running a normal slave revolt. He looked at the situation on the mountain, assessed the Roman position below, and made a decision that demonstrated military intelligence of a quality that Rome was completely unprepared for. He had his men weave ropes from the wild vines growing in the crater of Vesuvius. Then they lowered themselves down the far side of the mountain. The side Glaber had not bothered to watch because it was too steep and rocky to be a practical descent route. For men who had been training their bodies daily in a gladiatorial school, the physical demands of that descent were manageable. For Glaber's force camped comfortably at the base of the easy path, the arrival of Spartacus's men from an impossible direction was catastrophically surprising. The Romans were routed. Their camp was overrun before they could form any effective defense. Their equipment was seized, and the force that had been sent to end the slave problem on Vesuvius became the source of weapons and supplies that allowed the slave army to continue growing. The defeat of Glaber's force was the signal that transformed Spartacus's situation from a local disturbance into a genuine crisis. The news of what had happened on Vesuvius spread through the slave population of southern Italy with extraordinary speed. This was not simply news that some slaves had escaped. This was news that escaped slaves had defeated Roman soldiers, had taken their weapons and their camp and sent them running. That was information that changed calculations across an enormous population of people who had been told implicitly and explicitly their entire enslaved lives that Rome was invincible. Invincible things are not defeated by men with rope made from grapevines. The recruits began arriving in numbers that ancient sources describe with a sense of barely concealed disbelief, even from writers who had every reason to minimize what was happening. Rome sent another force, this time under the praetor Publius Varinius, with a larger force and a more serious mandate. What followed was a series of engagements across southern Italy in which Spartacus demonstrated repeatedly that his military thinking was operating at a level far above what Rome had anticipated or prepared for. He used terrain brilliantly, choosing ground that neutralized Roman tactical advantages and exploited the mobility of his force, which could move faster and more flexibly than Roman legions accustomed to fighting on open ground in formation. He used deception and misdirection. Ancient sources record an episode where he propped up dead bodies on stakes around his campfires to make it appear his force was still present while he moved his army away under cover of darkness. He was thinking like a general, not like a desperate fugitive. Verinius's forces were defeated in multiple engagements across the summer and autumn of 73 BC. These were not minor skirmishes. These were serious military defeats of Roman forces that left Spartacus in control of the entirety of southern Italy essentially unopposed. The slave army was growing continuously. Ancient sources give numbers in the tens of thousands by this point, drawn from the agricultural slave populations of Campania, Lucania, and Bruttium, the southernmost regions of the Italian peninsula where the latifundia system was most concentrated and where the ratio of slaves to free persons was highest. With each victory came more weapons, more supplies, more recruits, and perhaps most importantly, more evidence that the thing Rome's entire system depended upon, the belief in Roman invincibility, was not actually true. The internal organization of the slave army is one of the most fascinating and least discussed aspects of the entire revolt. Spartacus was not alone in leadership. Ancient sources mention two other leaders, Crixus and Enemaus, who commanded significant portions of the force and whose strategic priorities sometimes conflicted with Spartacus's. Crixus was Gallic, leading a substantial contingent of Gallic and Germanic slaves whose cultural background and strategic instincts were different from Spartacus's. The tensions between these factions would eventually prove significant, but in the early period the force functioned with a cohesion that was remarkable given the diversity of languages, cultures, and backgrounds it contained. Spartacus appears to have been the dominant strategic intelligence, the man whose military judgment the others deferred to even when they disagreed with his conclusions. He also did something in the management of his army that revealed a set of values that distinguished him from the Roman commanders he was fighting against in ways that ancient sources note with varying degrees of surprise. He distributed the spoils of their victories equally among all his followers rather than concentrating wealth at the top of the hierarchy. He prohibited the sale or possession of gold and silver by his followers. Everything was held communally and shared according to need rather than rank or origin. He treated prisoners taken in battle with a humanity that stood in stark and deliberate contrast to how Rome treated its slaves and captives. Whether these policies reflected a genuine philosophical commitment to equality or were primarily practical measures designed to maintain cohesion among a diverse force, probably both answers contained truth simultaneously. By the winter of 73 BC, Spartacus faced the most important strategic decision of the entire revolt. His army now numbered somewhere between 40 and 70,000 people according to various ancient estimates. A force large enough to be genuinely dangerous to Rome, but also a force with enormous logistical needs that required constant movement and constant acquisition of supplies from the territory they occupied. The question he faced was fundamental and has been debated by historians ever since. What was the revolt actually for? What was the goal? Because the answer to that question determined everything about what the army should do next and in what direction it should move. And the evidence suggests that Spartacus and his fellow commanders did not fully agree on the answer. The most coherent strategic goal that ancient sources attribute to Spartacus was escape, leading his followers north through Italy across the Alps and out of Roman territory entirely, allowing the people who had joined him to return to their homelands, or at minimum, to live outside the reach of Roman slavery. This was not a revolutionary program for abolishing slavery throughout the Roman world. It was not a plan to march on Rome and overthrow the Republic. It was something more immediate and more human, getting these specific people out. If this reading is correct, and most modern historians find it the most plausible interpretation, then Spartacus was not primarily a revolutionary idealist. He was a man trying to take the people who had trusted him somewhere safe. And the tragedy of what followed flows directly from the gap between that goal and what actually happened. In early 72 BC, the slave army split. Crixus and a significant portion of the Gallic and Germanic followers broke away from Spartacus's force and remained in southern Italy rather than moving north. The reasons for the split are not entirely clear from the sources. It may have been strategic disagreement about the northern escape plan. It may have been the preference of many slaves who had spent their entire lives in Italy and had no homeland to return to outside the Alps. It may have been cultural tensions between the Thracian and Gallic leadership that had been building for months. Whatever the specific reasons, the split was strategically catastrophic. The Roman consul Lucius Gellius Publicola moved against Crixus's separated force with a fresh consular army and destroyed it near Mount Garganus in Apulia. Crixus was killed in the fighting. Spartacus avenged Crixus in a way that revealed something about his relationship with the man he had led alongside, even through their disagreements. He held funeral games for Crixus, forcing 300 Roman prisoners to fight each other gladiatorially in Crixus's honor. The inversion was deliberate and pointed. Romans forced slaves to fight for Roman entertainment. Spartacus forced Romans to fight for a dead slave's honor. The symbolism was not accidental. This was a man who understood the language of Roman power and was speaking it back in the most direct way available to him. Whatever you think of the act itself, and it was brutal, the intelligence behind it was operating at a level that Rome's commanders consistently failed to fully appreciate until it was too late. He then did something that shocked Rome even more than the funerary games. He defeated not one, but both Roman consular armies in rapid succession. The armies of Gellius and of the other consul Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus. Defeating one consular army was extraordinary. Defeating both consular armies of the year in the same campaign season was the kind of military achievement that had not happened to Rome since Hannibal. The comparison was not lost on Roman commentators. Spartacus was moving north exactly as he had intended. His army swelling with each victory, drawing more recruits from the slave populations of central and northern Italy as word of the defeat spread. He reached the Alps. The exit was there. The freedom his people had been marching toward for 2 years was within reach. And then something went wrong. Why Spartacus turned back from the Alps is one of the great unanswered questions of ancient history. Ancient sources offer an explanation that most modern historians find insufficient. They say his followers refused to leave Italy, that they wanted to continue fighting and plundering rather than escaping over the mountains. This may contain truth. A force of 70 to 100,000 people drawn from across the Roman world contained enormous diversity of motivation and desire. Many had joined not because they wanted to escape to distant homelands they had never seen, but because they wanted to fight Rome, because they were furious and the army gave their fury direction and purpose. Managing that diversity of motivation while maintaining strategic coherence was a leadership challenge of extraordinary difficulty. But there is another possibility that historians have increasingly considered seriously. By the time Spartacus reached the Alps, his army was so large. Ancient sources suggest numbers approaching 100,000 people at peak, that the logistics of moving it over an alpine crossing in winter were genuinely daunting. This was not 78 gladiators with ropes anymore. This was an enormous force that needed feeding, housing, and moving through one of the most physically demanding terrains in Europe in conditions that would test even a professional Roman army with full supply infrastructure. The same size that made the army militarily formidable made it logistically almost impossible to move quickly. Whether Spartacus turned back by choice or necessity, or some combination of both, the result was the same. He was back in Italy, and Rome was done treating this as a police matter. The Roman Senate made the decision that acknowledged what everyone in Rome now understood. This was not a slave revolt, it was a war. They appointed Marcus Licinius Crassus to command the campaign against Spartacus with full consular authority and 6 new legions in addition to the forces already in the field. Crassus was the wealthiest man in Rome. Ancient sources say he believed no man could be considered rich unless he could fund an army himself, and Crassus could fund several. He was an effective general whose reputation had been somewhat overshadowed by the more glamorous careers of men like Sulla and Pompey, but who was competent, disciplined, and absolutely ruthless in his approach to the problem he had been given. He understood that Rome could not afford another defeat, and he intended to ensure there would not be one. His first action after taking command revealed his approach to military discipline with a clarity that ancient sources describe with a kind of grim admiration. A portion of his force under a legate named Mummius engaged Spartacus against Crassus's explicit orders and was defeated, the soldiers breaking and running in what Roman military culture considered the most shameful possible failure. Crassus responded by decimating the unit. The ancient practice of selecting by lot 1 in 10 soldiers for execution by their fellow soldiers. The men who had run were divided into groups of 10, drew lots, and whichever man in each group drew the short straw was beaten to death by the other 9. Ancient sources say 500 men were decimated. The rest of the army watched and understood what failure would cost them. There were no further unauthorized engagements. Crassus pursued Spartacus south. The slave army had moved back into the toe of Italy, the southernmost point of the peninsula, apparently with a plan to cross to Sicily, where a large slave population might provide additional recruits, and where the island's geography offered defensive possibilities. Ancient sources say Spartacus had arranged with Cilician pirates to provide ships for the crossing, and that the pirates took his money and sailed away without providing the ships. Whether this is accurate or whether the crossing was abandoned for other reasons, the result was that Spartacus found himself in the far south of Italy, with Crassus's force pressing him from the north and no obvious exit available. Crassus made the situation worse by constructing a wall. The wall Crassus built across the toe of Italy, approximately 50 kilometers of ditch and rampart cutting off the southernmost peninsula, was one of the most extraordinary military engineering projects of the late Roman Republic. 50 kilometers of fortification constructed across difficult terrain in a matter of weeks by Roman legionaries whose engineering capability was one of Rome's most consistent military advantages. The wall was designed to do what Gladiator had tried to do at Vesuvius on a continental scale: trap Spartacus's force and starve it into submission or force it to attack prepared Roman positions. It nearly worked. Ancient sources describe the slave army suffering serious food shortages during the weeks they were contained behind Crassus's wall. And then on a winter night, Spartacus broke through. He filled a section of the ditch with earth and debris and timber. Ancient sources say he used the bodies of prisoners and dead horses alongside conventional fill material, and moved a third of his army across the improvised crossing under cover of darkness and bad weather. The same intelligence and determination that had gotten his people down the side of Vesuvius 2 years earlier got them through Crassus's wall in the south of Italy. He was back in open country, but the situation had fundamentally changed from anything he had dealt with before. Crassus was behind him. The Senate had summoned Pompey from Spain, the most celebrated general of the era, who was now marching his veteran army toward Italy from the west. Another force under Lucullus was arriving from the east. The trap was closing from 3 directions simultaneously. The final weeks of the revolt were characterized by a fragmentation of Spartacus's force that may have been the result of disagreements about what to do next. The same tensions that had produced the split with Crixus 2 years earlier now reasserting themselves in a situation where the options were much worse. 2 significant portions of his army separated from the main force and were caught and destroyed by Crassus's pursuing legions. Spartacus was still moving north, toward Pompey, toward the confrontation that was coming regardless of which direction he moved. Ancient sources say he attempted to negotiate with Crassus at some point during this final phase, to reach a settlement that would end the fighting on terms. Crassus refused to negotiate with a slave. The word negotiation implies 2 parties Rome recognized as capable of making agreements. Slaves were not that. 71 BC. The final battle happened in Lucania in the south of Italy. The exact location is not identified with certainty in ancient sources, though various sites have been proposed. Spartacus's force, significantly reduced from its peak by the separations and defeats of the preceding weeks, faced Crassus's legions in open battle. Ancient sources describe Spartacus before the battle in terms that have become some of the most iconic images of the entire story. He killed his own horse before the battle began, telling his men that if they won, there would be plenty of horses taken from the Romans, and if they lost, he would not need one. He then fought his way toward Crassus personally, trying to reach the Roman commander directly, to end the battle in the way battles between leaders had been decided in an older tradition of warfare. He killed 2 centurions who tried to stop him. He was wounded in the thigh. Ancient sources say he dropped to one knee and kept fighting from that position, continuing to defend himself against the soldiers pressing around him until he was overwhelmed. His body was never identified after the battle. The fighting was apparently so intense and the casualties so high that finding one specific body among the thousands of dead was impossible or simply was not prioritized when the fighting ended. The man who had terrified Rome for 2 years, who had defeated consuls and praetors and made senators lie awake considering what it meant that slaves could fight, simply disappeared into the anonymous mass of the dead on a battlefield in southern Italy, whose exact location we cannot identify today. Crassus dealt with the approximately 6,000 survivors of the battle in the way Rome dealt with slave revolt. They were crucified along the Appian Way, the main road from Capua to Rome, one cross every few meters for the entire length of the road. The Appian Way ran for approximately 130 miles. 6,000 crosses along 130 miles of road was a calculation in terror. Every person who traveled between Capua and Rome for the months it took the bodies to decompose was traveling through a corridor of death specifically designed to communicate what happened to slaves who forgot what they were. It was the most effective advertisement Rome's system had ever produced. There would not be another revolt of this scale for the remainder of the Republic's existence. The political consequences of the revolt were significant and have been somewhat underappreciated in popular retellings that focus on the military drama. Crassus had done the hard work of defeating Spartacus, but Pompey arrived from Spain in time to intercept and destroy some of the fugitives from the final battle and immediately sent a letter to the Senate claiming credit for ending the war. This infuriated Crassus, who had spent 2 years and enormous personal resources on the campaign and felt, correctly, that the decisive work had been his. The rivalry between Crassus and Pompey that was already significant became more acute because of this dispute and fed directly into the political realignments of the following decade that would eventually produce the First Triumvirate, the alliance between Crassus, Pompey, and Julius Caesar that began the sequence of events ending in the fall of the Republic. The revolt also accelerated changes in the Roman agricultural economy that had been developing for other reasons. The latifundia system that depended on enormous numbers of agricultural slaves became somewhat less dominant in the decades after Spartacus, as the security risks of concentrating large slave populations in agricultural settings became more apparent to Roman landowners. This did not end Roman slavery. The institution would continue for centuries and remain central to the Roman economy throughout the imperial period. But the specific form that the slave economy had taken in southern Italy during the 2nd and early 1st centuries BC, the massive slave worked estates, gradually became less common in the period after the revolt as landowners made different calculations about the risks and costs of different forms of agricultural organization. Here is where the story of Spartacus becomes something different from the story of any other figure we have discussed on this channel. Because Spartacus did not simply become a historical figure after his death, he became an idea. And that idea has had a life across 2,000 years that has nothing to do with the actual historical person and everything to do with what people in every subsequent century needed him to represent. Within decades of his death, Roman writers were already using him as a reference point, not sympathetically, but as the ultimate example of the danger that slaves represented when allowed to organize. For Roman writers, he was the nightmare made real, the thing the slave system had always been capable of producing and had finally produced. For Renaissance humanists rediscovering classical texts, he became something different, a figure of natural liberty resisting tyranny, a man whose cause was just even if his methods were violent. The Enlightenment found in Spartacus an image of natural human freedom being suppressed by artificial social systems. Voltaire wrote about him. Various 18th century philosophers used him as a reference point in discussions of liberty and the nature of political authority. The French Revolution produced multiple plays and literary works centered on Spartacus as an image of oppressed people rising against illegitimate power. He was becoming a mirror that each age held up to its own concerns rather than a historical person whose actual motivations and experiences were being examined carefully. The 19th century added another layer to the Spartacus mythology that has proven extraordinarily durable. Karl Marx described Spartacus as his favorite hero in history, the finest fellow in the whole of ancient history according to Marx, a great general noble character, real representative of the ancient proletariat. This framing, Spartacus as the leader of a class struggle against economic exploitation, became enormously influential through the socialist and communist movements of the late 19th and 20th centuries. Revolutionary organizations across Europe took his name. Rosa Luxemburg's revolutionary group in Germany was called the Spartacist League. A communist uprising in Germany in 1919 was called the Spartacist Revolt. The actual historical Spartacus who was trying to escape over the Alps had been completely replaced by a symbolic Spartacus who was trying to overthrow the economic order. The 20th century added Hollywood to the layers of mythology. The 1960s Stanley Kubrick film starring Kirk Douglas is the version of Spartacus that most people carry in their heads. A grand epic of liberation and dignity with the famous scene where the defeated slaves each stand and declare, "I am Spartacus," to protect their leader from identification. That scene does not appear in any ancient source. It was invented for the screenplay by Dalton Trumbo, himself a blacklisted Hollywood writer who had been persecuted for his political beliefs and who brought his own experience of political solidarity and sacrifice to the script. The "I am Spartacus" moment is not history. It is a blacklisted screenwriter processing his own experience through the story of a Thracian slave. It is also one of the most emotionally powerful scenes in cinema history. So after all of this, the Roman sources, the Renaissance humanists, the Enlightenment philosophers, the Marxist revolutionaries, the Hollywood epic, who was the real Spartacus? What was he actually trying to do, and what does his story actually mean stripped of 2,000 years of projection? The honest answer requires sitting with some uncertainty that our culture is generally uncomfortable with. We do not know his motivations with the certainty that the mythology suggests. We do not know whether he was a visionary revolutionary or a man trying to get his people home. We do not know what he thought about at night when the camp was quiet and the responsibility for tens of thousands of lives rested on whatever plan he had managed to construct out of circumstances that were always moving faster than any plan could fully account for. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: he was an extraordinarily gifted military commander, probably the most talented irregular warfare commander Rome ever faced, with the possible exception of Hannibal, whose resources and strategic situation were incomparably better. He defeated trained Roman forces repeatedly over 2 years using a force that had no professional military training, no supply infrastructure, no institutional support, and no tradition of combined arms warfare to draw on. He did this while managing the internal politics of an enormously diverse coalition of people with different languages, different cultures, different goals, and different ideas about what the revolt was for. The organizational and leadership challenge alone, separate from the military challenge, was one of the most extraordinary in ancient history. He also appears to have been a genuinely unusual human being by the standards of his time in his treatment of the people around him. The equal distribution of spoils, the prohibition on gold and silver accumulation, the treatment of prisoners. These policies are consistent across multiple ancient sources that had no reason to present Spartacus sympathetically and that record these things apparently because they were genuinely remarkable to Roman observers accustomed to hierarchical distribution of wealth and brutal treatment of captives. Whether these policies reflected philosophical commitment or practical necessity, they created something in the slave army that Roman armies with all their professional training and institutional support struggled to replicate: genuine shared purpose among people who had been systematically dehumanized and who were fighting not for pay or glory, but for something more fundamental: the failure of the revolt. and it was a failure in the specific sense that it did not achieve freedom for the people who joined it. Was not primarily Spartacus's failure as a military commander. He won the battles he needed to win. He evaded the forces sent against him with extraordinary skill. He broke through Crassus's wall when being trapped behind it should have ended everything. The failure was structural and strategic in ways that no individual military genius could have fully overcome. He was fighting an empire, not an army, but a system that could replace defeated forces indefinitely, that could sustain losses that would end any normal political entity and keep sending more legions, that had been designed over centuries to absorb challenges to its authority and eliminate them through the inexorable application of overwhelming resources. The fundamental problem was that defeating Roman armies did not defeat Rome. Every victory produced a new army. Every destroyed legion was replaced by two more. The slave army had no equivalent depth. Every casualty was irreplaceable, every defeat permanent, every setback cumulative in ways that Rome's setbacks were not. Spartacus understood this. Ancient sources suggest he understood it clearly and that his northern strategy, the escape over the Alps, was precisely the recognition that military victory over Rome was not achievable and that the only viable goal was exit. The tragedy is that he could not fully implement the strategy that his own analysis told him was correct because the force he was leading had its own will and its own priorities that did not always align with his strategic judgment. 2,000 years after Spartacus died on a battlefield in Lucania, his story continues to matter in ways that go beyond historical interest. Not because of the romantic mythology that has accumulated around him. The revolutionary hero, the champion of the oppressed, the man who defied Rome and almost won. That mythology is powerful, but it is not history. It matters because of what it reveals about the actual human beings inside a system that had reduced them to objects. The slave army that followed Spartacus out of the school at Capua and across 2 years of campaigning in Italy was not an abstraction. It was hundreds of thousands of individual people who had been told their entire lives that they were property and who discovered on a mountain above a defeated Roman camp that they were something else. What they discovered was not what the mythology says they discovered. They did not discover that they could defeat Rome, or that slavery could be abolished, or that the social order could be overturned by sufficient courage and determination. What they discovered was smaller and more human and ultimately more important than any of those grand revolutionary claims. They discovered that the story Rome told about them, that they were property, that they existed to serve, that they had no legitimate claims on their own lives, was a story, not a fact. That the reality underneath that story was something different. That they were capable of courage and organization and loyalty and strategic thinking and all the other things that Roman civilization claimed as exclusively its own property. Spartacus matters not because he won. He did not win. He died on a battlefield, his body unidentified among the dead, and 6,000 of his followers were crucified along the road he had once walked as a slave, being transported to a school that would train him to kill for entertainment. That is not a victory by any conventional measure. Spartacus matters because of what the attempt itself demonstrated, that the people Rome had decided were not fully human were in fact fully human in every way that mattered. That they could think and plan and lead and inspire loyalty and make moral choices and die for something they believed in rather than simply for the entertainment of strangers in an arena. The attempt was the message. The message was received. Rome crucified 6,000 people to make sure everyone understood it. There is one more thing worth saying about Spartacus that the mythology consistently obscures because it does not fit the heroic narrative comfortably. He probably could not have won. Not because of any failure of courage or intelligence or military skill. He had all of those in abundance. But because the structural conditions of his situation made a successful outcome essentially impossible regardless of who was leading the revolt or how brilliantly they led it. The Roman slave system was too deeply embedded in the economic and social structure of the late Republic to be overthrown by military force applied from outside the system. The resources available to Rome for suppressing the revolt were too vast and too renewable. The exit options for the slave army were too limited and too difficult to execute with a force of that size and diversity. This does not diminish what he did. If anything, it makes it more extraordinary. He looked at a situation where the odds were essentially impossible, and he fought anyway, not out of delusion about his chances, but apparently out of a clear-eyed recognition that the alternative was continuing to live in a condition that was not living in any meaningful sense. The gladiatorial school at Capua was materially tolerable and psychologically unbearable for a man who understood what he was and what he was being used for. The revolt was not rational in a narrow cost-benefit sense. It was rational in the deeper sense that there are conditions under which fighting impossible odds is more genuinely human than accepting tolerable degradation. Spartacus chose to be human. Rome spent 2 years and enormous resources trying to make him regret it. He never regretted it. We know this not because any source tells us he expressed regret. None do. But because every action he took from the escape at Capua to the final battle in Lucania was the action of a man who had made his choice completely and was executing it with everything he had. He had chosen to be free or to die attempting freedom in a world that offered him neither as a legitimate option. He built something from nothing. An army, a movement, a 2-year challenge to the most powerful civilization on Earth. Using nothing but the minds and bodies of people the civilization had decided were objects. And he nearly pulled it off. Not nearly enough, but nearly enough that Rome had to crucify 6,000 people along 130 miles of road to make sure everyone got the message. The message Rome wanted to send was that this was what happened to slaves who forgot what they were. The message that actually traveled through history was something Rome did not intend and could not control. Because the 6,000 crosses along the Appian Way did not make people forget Spartacus. They made people remember him. Every person who walked that road in the months after the revolt, free Roman citizen, slave, trader, merchant, soldier, looked at those crosses and thought about the man who had put those people there. Not Crassus, Spartacus. Because it was Spartacus who had taken people the world had decided were nothing and shown that they were something. The crosses were Rome's response to that demonstration. But you cannot undemonstrate something. You can only try to make people afraid to remember it. Rome failed at that too. 2,000 years later, we are sitting here talking about Spartacus. Not about the praetor Glaber whose camp he overran on Vesuvius. Not about Verinius, whose forces he defeated across the summer of 73 BC. Not about Crassus, who built a wall across Italy and decimated his own troops to win. We remember Spartacus. We remember him because every generation since has needed to remember him, has found in his story something that speaks to their own experience of power and resistance and the gap between what systems say people are and what people actually are. He was a slave who refused to perform his slavery. He was a man who looked at the world's most powerful civilization and said no. And no is sometimes the most important word a human being can say. The final image I want to leave you with is not the battlefield in Lucania or the crosses along the Appian Way or any of the dramatic military moments that fill the 2 years of the revolt. It is the moment before any of that. It is the moment in the barracks of the gladiatorial school at Capua when Spartacus looked at the men around him. Men from Thrace and Gaul and Germany and Greece and every corner of the Roman world. Men who could not all speak the same language, who had different gods, different customs, different ideas about almost everything, and started talking to them about walking out the door. That moment. The moment when a person in an impossible situation decides to try anyway. That is the Spartacus that matters. That is the one history cannot crucify.